The wind was sharp that morning, cutting through the dense mist of the Argentine Andes. A team of archaeologists from Buenos Aires had been surveying the lower slopes of the Misiones province, searching for signs of pre-Columbian trade routes, when one of them spotted something strange jutting from the brush. At first, it looked like an outcropping of stone, swallowed by vines and moss. But as they drew closer, it became clear this wasn't natural. The formation was too square, too deliberate. What they found was a small stone structure hidden beneath decades of overgrowth, a single doorway sealed by collapsed timber and rusted metal. The air inside was stale, almost sweet, like old dust and forgotten secrets. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing walls lined with rough stone and the remnants of a wooden table. On it lay relics that should not have existed there: a rusted Luger pistol, a cracked pair of field binoculars, and a faded armband embroidered with the black and white insignia of the German Reich. The team fell silent. One archaeologist, Professor Santiago Rivera, crouched beside a half-buried trunk. Its hinges screamed as it opened, releasing a wave of decay and damp paper. Inside were documents written in German, maps of Europe, and a small leather-bound journal dated 1946. The first page, stiff with age, bore a single line written in spidery ink: "They will never find me here." Rivera's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The handwriting was methodical, deliberate, describing the journey of a man who had fled across the ocean, who spoke of snow-capped peaks and isolation as both punishment and sanctuary. The tone was cold, calculating, yet desperate. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the team exchanged uneasy glances. Whoever had written these words had not been an ordinary fugitive. The relics, the precision, the paranoia. They told the story of a man accustomed to command, someone who believed the war wasn't over. As they packed up the artifacts for transport, Rivera looked back at the structure, half buried in green and shadow, and felt the weight of history pressing against his chest. Whatever had happened there had been meant to stay hidden. But the mountain had other plans. Berlin, April 1945. The city was choking on smoke and fire. Allied artillery thundered in the distance, while Soviet tanks clawed their way through the ruins of a dying empire. Inside the collapsing headquarters of the Wehrmacht, orders were still being issued, orders that no longer mattered. Among the chaos stood Colonel Otto Weiss, once regarded as one of the Reich's most brilliant tacticians. Sharp-minded, meticulous, he had orchestrated several key defenses during the early years of the war. But as Germany crumbled, Weiss saw what others refused to. The end was inevitable. Witnesses later recalled a man calm amid hysteria, burning documents, destroying radio codes, and speaking quietly of a final escape. When Berlin fell, many senior officers were captured or executed. Otto Weiss, however, simply vanished. His name appeared on no surrender lists, his body on no battlefield. The official record would later state, "missing in action near Prague." But those who had known him whispered another story, that he had planned his disappearance for months, perhaps years. Rumors spread of a secret convoy headed south through Austria, of forged papers, of Vatican intermediaries who could provide passage to those with the right connections and gold to pay for silence. Across Europe, as Allied forces rounded up the last remnants of the Nazi elite, a network known as the Rat Lines was already at work, funneling fugitives out of Europe through Spain and Italy and across the Atlantic to South America. Argentina, under Juan Perón's sympathetic regime, became their sanctuary. Men like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele found refuge there under false names. And in the confusion of the post-war exodus, a new identity emerged in the Argentine immigration registry: Otto Wessel. Same age, same height, same sharp blue eyes in a faded photograph. The name would draw no attention for decades. But the man behind it had once signed orders that changed the fate of nations. For 77 years, his whereabouts remained a ghost story among historians, a rumor whispered in war archives and forgotten military files. until the day a team of archaeologists stumbled upon a crumbling stone shelter deep in the Argentine mountains, and the past, long buried, began to speak again. By the spring of 1946, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities lay in ruins, borders redrawn in blood and ash. Yet even as Allied forces secured victory, a quiet exodus began, a river of men slipping through the cracks of post-war chaos. They called them rat lines, secret escape networks that carried Nazi officers, scientists, and intelligence agents out of Europe under new identities. The Vatican's corridors became conduits of mercy and manipulation, where Red Cross travel papers were signed by trembling hands in dimly lit offices. In Genoa and Rome, priests turned a blind eye while former SS officers boarded ships bound for freedom. Some ended up in Spain under Franco's sympathetic regime. Others found passage through Italy, disguised as displaced civilians. But the most coveted destination was half a world away, Argentina. Under President Juan Perón, Argentina promised protection and anonymity, offering sanctuary to those who could bring technical expertise or foreign investment. The Argentine coast became a new frontier for old ideologies. Ships from Genoa arrived in Buenos Aires with cargo holds filled not only with refugees, but with fugitives, men whose crimes had rewritten the 20th century. Among the whispers circulating in Allied intelligence circles was the tale of one fugitive who didn't take the usual route. They called him Colonel W., a high-ranking officer who had disappeared from a military installation in Hamburg just weeks before Germany's surrender. Some claimed he boarded a U-boat headed for the southern Atlantic, part of a final desperate convoy carrying stolen gold, classified documents, and fugitives of the Reich. The submarine was never officially accounted for. When Allied forces opened Nazi archives in 1946, one file referenced Operation Vulcan, a coded exfiltration plan that mentioned an Otto Weiss. The page was torn halfway down. Nothing more was written. Whether the U-boat reached Argentina or sank beneath the icy Atlantic remains a mystery. But not long after, a man calling himself Otto Wessel arrived in Buenos Aires with a suitcase of German documents and a small gold insignia hidden in its lining. He registered as an agricultural engineer from Dresden. No one questioned him. They never did. The 1950s brought prosperity to Argentina, but beneath the surface, another world was taking shape, one built on secrets, silence, and the lingering shadow of the Reich. Across the provinces of Córdoba, Bariloche, and Misiones, small German communities flourished in the mountains. They looked innocent enough, villages with tidy wooden homes, alpine bakeries, and Oktoberfest celebrations that felt transported straight from Bavaria. But behind the smiles and beer halls, there were whispers. Locals spoke of newcomers who avoided cameras, who paid in old coins stamped with eagles, and who never aged in the photographs kept in dusty town halls. They were called Los Alemanes del Sur, the Germans of the South. In one remote settlement near San Martín de los Andes, farmers told stories of a man who arrived in 1947, pale and formal, speaking Spanish with a clipped precision. He bought a tract of mountain land, accessible only by a single dirt trail. Locals helped him build a stone house overlooking a valley dense with fog. He called it Haus Edelweiss. He never came to town again. Supplies appeared at his property by mule, left at the gate by hired hands, who said he watched them from the trees. At night, lights flickered through the windows, sometimes red, sometimes green, like signals meant for no one. Children who wandered too close to the property line swore they heard voices speaking in a foreign tongue, low and rhythmic, like prayers or commands. No one dared to approach after that. In Buenos Aires, immigration officials began to notice patterns, clusters of arrivals from Europe, men with nearly identical paperwork and vague professions, engineer, foreman, architect. Yet whenever inquiries were made, the files disappeared. It was as if someone powerful wanted the past to stay buried. And buried it remained until decades later, when a team of archaeologists unearthed a stone shelter in the Andes, and the name Otto Weiss surfaced again, this time carved into the back of a rusted helmet, waiting 77 years to be found. For decades, Otto Weiss was a ghost, a name whispered in archives and war tribunals, a file stamped missing in action and sealed in the chaos of 1945. Officially, he had vanished near Prague in the final days of the war, last seen retreating with a shattered infantry unit before the Soviets arrived. No body, no confirmation, just silence. The Allies listed him among the dead, one of thousands swallowed by the final collapse of the Reich. But history, as it often does, left cracks for the truth to seep through. In 1947, 2 years after Weiss's supposed death, an Argentine immigration officer in Buenos Aires recorded the arrival of a man named Otto Wessel. His Red Cross passport listed him as an agricultural engineer from Dresden. The photo attached was faded, but the face, sharp features, slicked back hair, and cold, intelligent eyes bore an uncanny resemblance to the missing colonel. The birth date was identical, the signature nearly matched. Most damning of all was the timing. The same month, Allied intelligence intercepted chatter about a high-ranking Nazi officer who had escaped justice through Vatican channels. The coincidence was too precise. When historians decades later compared the documents, the similarities were undeniable. Otto Weiss had not died in Europe. He had shed his name like a uniform and resurfaced under the protection of new papers, a new country, and a regime willing to turn its back for the right price. But who was Otto Wessel in Argentina? Immigration records showed him purchasing land in the Andes, not far from San Martín de los Andes, a region thick with other German expatriates. He paid in gold marks, long obsolete, but perfectly preserved. His trail after 1949 goes cold. No tax records, no hospital visits, no death certificate. It was as if he'd stepped into the mountains and dissolved into legend. When the archaeologists found the bunker nearly 77 years later, the truth began to solidify. The leather-bound journal, the Reich insignias, the handwriting, all matched military documents signed by Colonel Otto Weiss in 1944. The man who was supposed to have died on a Czech battlefield had lived, and hidden, in the Argentine mountains, until time and nature finally buried him. 2 months after the initial discovery, the archaeological team returned to the Andes with reinforcements, linguists, historians, and forensic specialists. Their destination sat nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, accessible only by mule trail and hidden beneath dense, choking foliage. What had first appeared to be a single ruin turned out to be part of something far more deliberate, a compound. 3 structures emerged from the jungle as the team cleared away vines and debris: a small stone cabin, a tall cylindrical tower overlooking the valley, and a subterranean bunker sealed behind corroded steel doors that had not been opened in generations. The isolation was staggering. From the ridge, the valley stretched endlessly into a wall of mist and forest. There were no villages, no roads, no power lines, just silence and the steady whisper of the wind moving through pine and moss. Inside the cabin, the team found a wood-burning stove, rusted cookware, and the faint remains of a cot pressed against the wall. Everything was arranged with military precision. The watchtower was sturdier, its narrow windows offering full command of the surrounding terrain, a perfect vantage point for anyone expecting to be hunted. But it was the bunker that drew the most attention. After 3 days of careful excavation, the team finally breached the sealed entrance. A gust of cold, stale air rushed out like a sigh from the past. What lay beyond was astonishing. A hidden world perfectly preserved in shadow. Shelves lined with canned goods, a generator built from repurposed engine parts, maps pinned to the walls, their corners curled with age. And on the far side of the room, a cot draped in tattered sheets. Beside it, a typewriter, its keys frozen mid-sentence. Carved into the concrete above the bed were 5 words in German. Ich warte auf das Signal. I am waiting for the signal." The team stood in silence, their flashlights flickering across relics of another lifetime. In that moment, the myth of Otto Weiss became something far more tangible. The mountain had kept his secret. Now it was ready to tell it. The first beam of light to pierce the darkness in 77 years came from a trembling hand. When the archaeologists finally broke through the bunker's steel door, a low groan echoed across the mountain valley, as if the earth itself were exhaling. The air that poured out was heavy and sour, thick with the smell of oil and dust. Inside, the silence was absolute. Every step stirred clouds of ancient stillness. Their flashlights swept across a narrow corridor that opened into a series of rooms, each more unsettling than the last. Against one wall sat a diesel generator, its tank long dry but its wiring neatly coiled, ready for use. Metal shelves sagged under the weight of canned meats and vegetables, the labels written in German script from the 1940s. A crate of medical supplies lay open beside a military cot, morphine vials, bandages, and a single syringe still capped in brittle glass. The attention to order was unmistakable. Whoever had lived here had done so not in panic, but in preparation. Then came the discovery that confirmed everything. A small wooden desk, covered in a film of grime, stacked with papers bearing the unmistakable black eagle of the Reichsadler. The documents were military in nature: field orders, radio codes, ration logs, all stamped with the insignia of Colonel Otto Weiss. Behind the desk hung a large map of Europe, edges yellowed and curling. Red pencil marks traced the front lines of 1945, while black arrows, drawn with steady precision, snaked southward across the continent, through Italy, across the Atlantic, and into Argentina. The path ended with a small X drawn deep in the Andes. Beside it, scrawled in faded ink, was a single word: Heimat, home. A shortwave radio sat nearby, its dials still set to a European frequency. The archaeologists exchanged glances, the reality settling in. This was no myth. They were standing inside the post-war hideout of a man who had once commanded soldiers for the Third Reich. And here, hidden in the folds of the Andes, he had rebuilt a fragment of that lost world, waiting, listening, believing that one day the fatherland would call him back. The journal was found buried inside a tin box beneath the desk, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, as if its owner knew it would be discovered one day. The leather cover was cracked, the pages brittle, but intact. On the first page, written in neat Gothic script, were the words, "O Weiss, 1946. The early entries were methodical, almost bureaucratic, a chronicle of escape. Weiss described leaving Hamburg aboard a submarine bound for the Canary Islands, transferring to a fishing vessel under false papers, and finally landing in Buenos Aires under the name Otto Vessel. He wrote of warm nights, strange constellations, and the relief of anonymity. "The world has forgotten us," one line read, "but the Reich does not die. It merely sleeps." As the pages turned, the tone darkened. By 1949, the entries grew erratic. He mentioned letters that never arrived, coded radio signals that faded into static, and the isolation of the mountains that began to feel like both sanctuary and tomb. One passage spoke of men who come at night, of whispers in the wind and footprints he swore were not his own. Another described how the valley seemed to hum, as if listening. The paranoia deepened with each year. He wrote of dreams filled with ash and marching feet, of hearing phantom transmissions through the static. "They are calling," he wrote, "but I cannot tell if it is them or something else." The last entry was dated 1962, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "The signal has not come, supplies are gone, the sky is red again tonight. If they come, I will not be taken alive." The ink trailed off mid-line, smudged by what looked like water or perhaps blood. The archaeologists stood in silence, the journal open between them. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a faint echo that might have been nothing, or the last breath of a man who refused to surrender even when the war was long over. In the mountain village of San Martín de los Andes, the past is never truly gone. It lingers in the spaces between generations, passed down in stories told around fireplaces on cold winter nights. When word spread that a team of archaeologists had uncovered a hidden bunker deep in the nearby range, the oldest residents simply nodded, as if the discovery confirmed something they had always known. El Soldado Fantasma, they said, the ghost soldier. Their grandparents had spoken of him, a tall, pale man with piercing eyes and a rigid posture who appeared from the forest once every few months to trade for supplies. He never came to town, never spoke more than a few words of Spanish, and all was paid with coins older than anyone had ever seen, thick, heavy gold marks stamped with an eagle clutching a swastika. Children were warned not to wander too far into the valley after dusk. Some swore they'd heard strange music drifting through the trees, haunting, mournful songs sung in a foreign tongue. Others whispered of torchlight moving among the hills, vanishing whenever anyone drew close. One farmer claimed that his father had once followed the ghost soldier at a distance, watching as he knelt before a crude stone cross deep in the forest and buried something at its base. The next morning, the ground there was smooth again, as if untouched. The villagers said he vanished one winter without a trace. Some believed he had died in the mountains, claimed by the cold. Others thought he'd simply walked into the mist and kept going, searching for a war that no longer existed. When the archaeologists showed them photos of the man from the journal, the sharp features, the stern expression, the elders recognized him instantly. "That's him," one woman whispered, "El hombre del oro," the man of gold. For decades, his story had been dismissed as folklore, a mountain legend to scare children and entertain tourists. But now, with the bunker unearthed and the journal recovered, the line between myth and history blurred. The ghost soldier had been real, and he had left something behind. In the days following the excavation, as investigators cataloged the bunker's contents, one discovery eclipsed all others. Beneath a loose section of floorboards in the main chamber, they uncovered a rusted metal crate. Inside, wrapped in decaying canvas, were rows of gleaming gold ingots. Each bore the same unmistakable stamp, Deutsche Reichsbank, the central bank of Nazi Germany. The serial numbers matched entries from wartime ledgers, documenting shipments of gold confiscated from occupied territories and concentration camps. These shipments had vanished without explanation in 1945, their fate a mystery that had haunted historians for decades, until now. The weight of what they had found was staggering, not just in material value, but in moral gravity. Weiss hadn't merely fled to save himself, he had carried with him a fortune stolen from the dead, a final act of loyalty to a regime that no longer existed. Investigators pieced together a possible route. Weiss, using his influence and military connections, had secured access to hidden vaults during the Reich's collapse. When Berlin fell, he loaded gold and documents onto a U-boat bound for the South Atlantic. The journal's early entries hinted at this, mentions of the cargo, the burden, and a debt owed to history. The ingots confirmed it. The Argentine government quickly intervened, sealing the site and ordering the artifacts transferred to Buenos Aires for safekeeping. But not everyone agreed that the discovery should be made public. Some officials feared what it might reveal about Argentina's post-war past. How many doors had been opened? How many eyes had looked away? Forensic analysis found traces of moisture and decay on the crates, but one detail stood out: faint fingerprints preserved in oxidized residue. They belonged to a man in his 40s, consistent with Otto Weiss in 1947. It seemed that, even in hiding, he had refused to let go of the Reich's spoils. The gold was his link to the empire he had served, his final connection to a world he believed would rise again. But as the last bars were carried from the mountain, one question lingered like a shadow. What else had Weiss buried beneath the stone cross, and why had he chosen to hide it? When the bunker's contents became known, international intelligence agencies took notice. Declassified Allied files later revealed that Otto Weiss had, in fact, been placed on an early CIA watch list in the late 1940s. His name appeared, shadowed by other war criminals, under the category of persons of interest who had vanished into Latin America under false identities. But by the 1950s, the trail went cold. No operation was launched to find him. The files were quietly closed, intelligence reports archived and shelved, investigations shelved as though the case itself had been erased. Why would agencies abandon a man so clearly linked to war crimes, hiding in plain sight? Some historians speculate a hidden bargain. In exchange for intelligence on Soviet networks, Weiss may have gained tacit immunity. During the early days of the Cold War, former Nazis with expertise in logistics, intelligence, and counterinsurgency were sometimes quietly recruited or tolerated by Western services, eager for assets in the confrontation with communism. Could it be that Weiss traded his silence and secrets for a cloak of invisibility? Another theory suggests bureaucratic fatigue and fragmentation. Post-war intelligence structures were chaotic. Records were lost or misfiled. Agents died, priorities shifted, and by mid-1950s, the hunt for obscure Nazi fugitives was no longer a pressing concern for governments scrambling to rebuild. The existence of Weiss in Argentina, behind forged documents and local anonymity, simply slipped below the radar. In one internal memo, a CIA analyst noted, "Subject may be cooperating. Proceed with caution. Archive for further review." That memo was never followed. When Argentina declassified files decades later, new columns revealed local police reports of strange German arrivals in the late 1940s, possibly matches. But those leads had never been cross-checked with international dossiers. Thus, for half a century, Otto Weiss existed as a phantom, on the margins of intelligence systems, known but unpursued. He was a man whose name survived in classifications, yet whose body stayed hidden. And in the silence of bureaucratic inaction, the myth of Colonel Weiss grew until fate and nature conspired to force him into the open again. Almost a year after the bunker's discovery, forensic teams returned to the site with heavy equipment and ground-penetrating radar. Beyond the compound, just downslope, they located a shallow grave, partially obscured by moss and leaf litter. The grave was simple, earth turned slightly, a stone slab cracked into halves, roots curling through the fissures. Archaeologists and forensic anthropologists pried the slab open. Inside lay human remains wrapped in a threadbare coat, bearing a faded Wehrmacht colonel's insignia. A belt buckle, buckled precisely, bore the eagle and swastika motif. The uniform fabric was decayed, but the insignia stitching remained discernible. They exhumed the body with reverence. In a tent lit by lanterns, the bones were laid out on a table. Dental records, isotope analysis, and bone morphology confirmed something extraordinary. This was not a local or a wanderer. The remains were European in origin. The age at death was estimated to fall in the late 50s, early 60s, not long after Weiss was known to be active in hiding. Radiocarbon and chemical assays showed that the person had lived many years in a mountain climate at high altitude. DNA testing indicated a match within the limits of degraded samples to family lines traced back to Germany, lines consistent with the missing Colonel Weiss. The team compared the journal's final ominous sentence, "If they come, I will not be taken alive," with the state of the body. There were no signs of skeletal trauma or bullet holes. Yet a peculiar piece of evidence drew their attention. The skull bore a small perforation near the base, too neat for natural decay, too irregular for a simple bullet hole. It hinted at something surgical or self-inflicted. The coat, still draped around the remains, was buttoned carefully, the wrists cross-lapped. In the final hours, perhaps Weiss intended to die on his own terms. As the wind stirred across the mountain pass, the forensic report sat among the ruins. Otto Weiss had perished in the shadows he himself had constructed. The body in the mountains was the man who had defied death for decades, and finally, under the weight of isolation and time, yielded to secrecy's deadliest embrace. In the months following the discovery, historians, intelligence analysts, and journalists converged on the mountain site, each trying to untangle the threads Otto Weiss had left behind. What began as the story of a fugitive colonel soon widened into something far more complex, a network that spanned borders and decades. Among the papers recovered from the bunker were several sealed envelopes, their ink faded but legible. The letters were written in a disciplined hand, all addressed to names that at first seemed fictional, but cross-referencing them with recently declassified European archives revealed chilling matches. Former SS officers and Abwehr agents who had also disappeared after the war. The correspondence spoke of the brotherhood, of continuing the mission, and of a future built from the ashes. They weren't random notes. They were communications between men scattered across Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay, each one a ghost, living under false names. Together, they formed what Weiss referred to as Das Netzwerk, the network. Historians quickly linked these letters to known colonies of German expatriates that had sprouted in the southern cone after 1945. In Chile, the infamous enclave of Colonia Dignidad. In Paraguay, hidden settlements guarded by men who still wore fragments of old uniforms. The letters hinted at coordinated meetings, financial transfers, and coded references to the resurrection, a phrase some interpreted as plans for a new order, a Fourth Reich rising quietly in the New World. Yet, despite the sinister tone, there was no evidence that the dream ever materialized. The correspondences grew sporadic by the early 1960s, then stopped altogether, as if the men themselves had either died or finally realized that history had moved on without them. Still, the implications were haunting. Weiss had not been a hermit clinging to the past. He was part of a living network, a clandestine alliance of ideologues who refused to let go of the Reich's shadow. They had traded gold, shared intelligence, and dreamt of a return that never came. When the bunker's findings were made public, the world shuddered at the realization that these men had walked among ordinary citizens for decades, their crimes unpunished, their loyalties undiminished. The ghosts of the war had not been buried. They had simply changed their addresses. When the ruins of Weiss's hideout were opened to the public, the mountain seemed to exhale a long-held breath. Descendants of Holocaust survivors and historians from across the world gathered at the site, standing among the cold stones that had once sheltered a man who believed history could be rewritten in isolation. The mood was solemn, the air heavy with the unspoken truth that this was more than a historical discovery. It was a moral mirror held up to the past. For those who had lost families in the camps, the name Otto Weiss was no longer just a footnote. It was a reminder that justice delayed was still justice demanded. Candles were lit among the ruins. A rabbi whispered a prayer for the dead, not just for those buried beneath European soil, but for the forgotten victims whose gold and memories had been carried across the ocean by men like Weiss. A historian from Berlin described it best. He built a fortress to keep the world out, but in doing so, he preserved the evidence of his own guilt. Even in death, Weiss forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth, that evil does not always end with the fall of empires. It endures in silence, in the spaces between generations, in the complacency of those who choose to forget. The hideout was sealed again, this time not as a sanctuary, but as a memorial. A plaque was placed at its entrance inscribed in German and Spanish. May silence never again protect those who fled from justice. As the last visitors departed, the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the stone bunker. The valley fell quiet once more, the wind whispering through the pines. But the story of Colonel Otto Weiss, his escape, his secrets, his defiance, would not fade. The mountain had kept its silence for 77 years. Now it spoke with a single message that echoed far beyond the Andes. The past is never truly buried. The mountain is silent again. Weeks after the last investigators and historians departed, the entrance to the bunker was sealed, this time not to hide what it contained, but to preserve it. A concrete slab covers the rusted steel door, etched with a single inscription in both Spanish and German. For the dead, for the living, for those who remember. The government declared the site a memorial, a warning carved into the bones of the Andes. No one is permitted to enter now. The air within remains untouched, the relics left exactly as they were found, the generator, the maps, the journal resting on the desk where it was last opened. The wind that once howled through the broken corridors now hums softly through cracks in the stone, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and dust. Every year, a few travelers make the pilgrimage up the old mule trail. Some are historians, others descendants of the vanished, a few simply curious souls drawn by the magnetism of the mystery. They stand before the sealed door, gazing at the valley below, where the clouds roll like waves against the peaks, and imagine the man who once called this place home, a man who waited for a signal that would never come. Time has turned his fortress into a tomb, his defiance into a cautionary tale. At dusk, the mountain seems to breathe again. The light fades to gold, shadows stretching across the ridges like old scars. In the stillness, it's easy to believe the stories, the whispers of footsteps inside, the echo of a voice reciting orders to no one, the faint crackle of a radio picking up signals from a world long gone. Perhaps it's the wind, or perhaps it's something else, the residue of a life lived in secrecy and fear, still lingering in the stones. The documentary cameras fade out on the horizon, the Andes bathed in dying light, the wind sweeping through empty corridors once filled with fear and obsession. A narrator's voice cuts through the silence, steady, reflective, heavy with the weight of history. The war may have ended in 1945, but some ghosts take longer to die. As night falls over the mountains, the wind howls once more, carrying with it the echoes of a past that refuses to rest. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, behind walls of stone and silence, the story of Colonel Otto Weiss remains, watching, waiting, remembered. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.